Hey everybody, my name is Chuck Hayward. I'm a screenwriter and television writer, and I'm here hosting my Friend's Place panel this evening about how homelessness is not colorblind. And we have just a little bit about my Friend's Place. It's a resource center for young people experiencing homelessness. They can come by and get clothing and food, and get assigned a caseworker. They can get job training. They can have a mailbox so that they can apply for jobs and stuff like that. Anything that can help sort of get them back onto their feet and put them out there into the world. So it's an organization that I've been involved in a couple different capacities. Just originally as a donor, but then also as a volunteer for a period of time. So I was able to see firsthand what great work they do and how dynamic the staff and the young people are that they service. So, it's something I'm incredibly proud to be a part of. And we have some really incredible panelists tonight and I'll let them introduce themselves a little bit. Up first, we've got Toni Cooper.
Hello, my name is Toni Cooper. I am the Data and Impact Coordinator at My Friend's Place. I've been working at My Friend's Place for 3 years, and my passion is data. My passion is homelessness and seeing how we can end homelessness, both youth homelessness as well as adult homelessness. This panel is very important and super relevant right now. And I think it's always been relevant, but it's super relevant because people are actually willing to listen. And I'm just so excited to be on the panel, and I'm excited to be here.
All right, awesome. And next up, we have Konstantin Hatcher.
Hey everyone, how you doing? Konstantin Hatcher. I am the statewide organizing director for California YIMBY, a housing advocacy nonprofit whose one of our main goals is to turn back the detrimental tides of an impact of racist housing policies had on our housing market and communities of color, but also just how that has lent its way to this incredible housing crisis and housing insecurity that we have currently in the state. I come to this work from a bunch of different places. I worked in campaigns for a long time. I was on both Obama campaigns. Lastly, the Operation Vote Director for the state of Wisconsin. I've worked on a bunch of local campaigns, local issue advocacy around education, around racial equity, and also trying to deal with systemic oppression, and just an activist overall. I'm super excited to be here and talking with you all. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity.
All right, thank you. And then up next, we have Dr. Wayne Byrd.
Hey everybody, I'm Dr. Wayne Byrd. I am a longtime admirer of MFP and supporter of MFP. I'm a filmmaker. I'm a social entrepreneur that's working in the regenerative agricultural space right now. We're launching a company that aims to change our food system and make it part of the solution to healing our environment, stabilizing our climate. We're going to use the power of regenerative agriculture to heal the planet, repair some things, and use the power of nature to repair mankind. So I come to this panel with 43 years of experience in being Black, and I think it's going to be interesting to hear all of the different experiences, because we know we're not a monolith, but I'm here to share some of my perspective.
Great, awesome, thank you guys. So yeah, we're excited to jump in here just to kind of frame it up and what we're talking about here. Obviously in the news lately, there's been a lot of talk about police violence and how that disproportionately affects people of color. And it's sort of forced everyone to look at how the broader systems that are existing in America also disproportionately affect people of color. And I'm gonna, there's an old saying that about that disparity is that when white people get a cold, Black people get pneumonia, meaning that the negative effects are usually so much more harsh and so much more problematic for us due to any number of things, whether it's access to resources or just systemic racism that keeps us from, as Konstantin was saying, like in the housing area, like things that keep us out of the running the same way that our white counterparts are. And Toni, I'm going to throw to you real quick because as our stats person, yeah, I know that the headline that you gave me was that homelessness affects Black people 4 to 5 times more than the white counterparts, but I know you can break it down on a much more micro level. So I will kick it to you for that, and then we'll get into the conversation of why that probably is.
Absolutely. So when talking about the data, I will talk about MFP data. So data that we've collected when you come into our space. We collect demographic information, as well as get some information around what their needs are. So I'll be sharing some information from MFP, and then I'll also be sharing some county level data that will be presented from LAHSA. So LAHSA is the Los Angeles Homeless Service Authority, and they do a homeless count annually. And so they are able to collect data on how many people are experiencing homelessness on a given night and some of those demographics. So in Los Angeles County, 3,926 youth were homeless any given night in 2019. And in the last fiscal year, MFP served 1,400 youth. So as relating to age, youth at MFP are between the ages of 12 and 24. When looking at gender at MFP, 65% of our youth identify as male, 30% identify as female, 4% identify as transgender, and 1% identify as non-binary. For LA County, we see very similar numbers. So according to LAHSA, of youth experiencing homelessness, 61% identify as male, 36% identify as female, 3% identify as transgender, and 1% identify as gender nonconforming. When looking at race at MFP, 46% of our youth identify as Black or African American, 18% identify as Latino, 15% identify as mixed. And what we've seen with our mixed youth is that many of them are actually African American. They're not biracial or multiracial. However, I think they feel more comfortable with identifying themselves as mixed. And then 13% of our youth identify as Caucasian, 1% identify as Asian, and another 1% identify as Native American. And again, for race, our numbers are pretty similar to what LAHSA reports. So 40% identify as Black or African American, 39% identify as Latino, 16% identify as white, 3% identify as multiracial or mixed, and 1% identify as Asian. So that's a bit of the racial breakdown that we have at MFP, as well as what we see locally through what LAHSA reports.
That is a troubling sort of trend where the percentage of Black people who are in the population generally, these numbers that are experiencing homelessness are so much greater. So that's a real unfortunate thing. And when I was talking to Dan, who's one of the organizers of this panel, he gave me kind of an interesting and kind of alarming sort of perspective on how the differences between how race is perceived from white people and Black people. It's my personal opinion that we as Black people tend to assume that white people know as much about racism as we do, just because it's been around for so long. But obviously the direct knowledge that we have about it through our own experiences gives us just a little bit more of an expertise on it. And I think that we're just now starting to have white people be more open to hearing what that expertise is. Whereas before, I feel like it so either pay lip service to it or not fully agree with it 100%. So just wanted to kind of get into some of the ways that you think race is viewed differently from white people to Black people. And I'll throw it to whoever has a line on that real quick. Anyone want to jump in there? Just kind of how you've sort of experienced that race means different things to white people or Black people or Latino or Asian people. What's the?
Yeah, I think that I think that one of the difficulties that white folks have, I think up until this moment and this is part of, and we'll get to that probably a little bit later in terms of how in this particular moment, it's a little different. It's a little more transformative. But typically, an admission of racism now, and I think most white people admit that they would be willing to admit, oh, there's a bad actor that is racist, that individual actor, right? But overall, up until this moment, there's been a lot of difficulty dealing with systems of racism, which are by far those are the ones that actually need to be dismantled. That's actually where the argument and the movement is pushing for and needs to happen, where the move towards equity needs to happen, towards ending repression needs to happen. And I think for white folks, by admitting it, that also then now, it means a whole lot of now things that they have to now unpack, right? It means that the whole mythology of pull yourself up by the bootstraps has to be looked at again, right? And explored. The fact that, you know, they can't say, oh, well, that was in the past 200 years ago. Now it enforces upon them that now it's just my problem and now I have to take action. It threatens an advantage that they've had for 450 years, right? And I don't know very many people, whoever you talk to is going to raise their hand and say, hey, I don't want any more advantages, right? I mean, if they're really looking internally at themselves. And so, and then the other side, it's just not living the experience. If you don't wake up wearing the coat of Blackness, you just don't understand. It's not your lived experience. You know, the way you walk through life is completely different. You walk into a room, you're not the one person that looks like you or the two people that look like you. You don't have that experience. You haven't had to deal with a lifetime of discomfort. So it's just hard to conceive when you're not living it, right? It's easy to conceive it as an actor. And I think most people will say, oh yeah, there's actors, racist actors, right? That the caricature of the Ku Klux Klan member or the racist or the David Duke, right? But it's the denial of this is actually a system of oppressed people that I have benefited from. Because if you have to admit that I have benefited from this system, then it forces you to actually have to take onus and action to rectify a situation.
I think Konstantin makes a good point about proximity. My wife and I are moving to Hawaii, and I remember looking at, on the internet, I remember looking at a piece of property that looked really interesting. And online, the more I looked at it, I thought, wow, this place is perfect. It just might be right. You know, I saw the environment it was in. I saw some of the land it was on. I saw it had macadamia nut trees, and I saw it had these separate dwellings on the property. So Sarah and I fly out there, and one of the first places we go to visit is this property. When we finally show up and we're there in person, it was a dump. It was so different than what we perceived from afar. But it wasn't until we were there in person that we understood, oh, these walls are falling down. Oh, there's space between the doors and the floors. Oh, there's mildew. Oh, you can hardly breathe in here. Oh, there's wild pigs running everywhere in the backyard. This is not the experience I thought it was, and I couldn't tell that until we got there and had some proximity. We had intimacy with that space. And I think that makes sense of a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the differences in the way we see race and understand the racial experience. They're very far removed from the experience. And I think it gives us a perspective on why so much of what they're seeing right now is creating this huge swell of emotion. And I'm kind of excited. I'm kind of happy that there is this new empathy and there's this new proximity to the experiences in their faces. And I hope that this empathy lasts and continues and grows into other things, grows into, for example, an intention to repair, which I hope we get to in this conversation. But I think proximity, to Konstantin's point, is very important.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, it's okay. One thing that I would just add to that is that I think when thinking about race, I think a lot of white people focus on racism and this idea that they do not feel like they are superior to Black people, but they don't focus on implicit bias. And I think with implicit bias, there's this idea that a Black man can walk beside you and you're clutching your bag, and you may not think that you are superior to this Black man, but there's some stereotype that you have about him where you think that he is aggressive, that he is a thug, that he is going to steal something from you. And that's just as insidious as racism. And so I think that the difference is that we have to be ready to deal with that implicit bias and understand those effects, and not just say, oh, I'm not racist, so I don't have a problem, I don't have an issue. We all have biases, and we have to become aware of them, and we have to deal with them. So I think that's one of the biggest differences that I've seen. I am very aware and cognizant of implicit bias, while I think a lot of my white peers are not so aware. And I think that causes a lot of issues when you're trying to have these conversations, because they become very defensive, and it's just, I'm not racist. It's like, I'm not saying you're racist, but you definitely have some biases. And I think that we really need to talk about it. So that's one of the biggest differences that I've seen.
That's a really good point, Toni. And just to even build on that more, the concept of superiority of white supremacy is lost, because they say, well, hell, I'm poor. I struggled. I worked hard. My parents weren't rich. How am I benefiting from a system of supremacy? So they don't. It's also that lack of understanding of what the issue is and really what supremacy means, right? It means that you don't have to walk through life, to Toni's point, and deal with those microaggressions every single day. And so not having to have that, not having that understanding, which, to Wayne's point, hopefully we're seeing a lot more of this understanding develop through the present discourse, and through the protests and the discussion around the protests, and white people talking to other white people about it. We're starting to see more of this recognition of an understanding of what supremacy actually is, which has been missing in the past.
Right, and I think I neglected to include Dan's point earlier when I mentioned it, but it was that the common misconception among white America is that slavery ended, as soon as the Civil War was over, and Jim Crow ended with MLK, and then racism ended with Obama's election. And when he said that, I was like, wow, it kind of blew me away, because I was like, I think that might be part of the issue. And so it's hard to have, like Konstantin was saying, these conversations when we're not starting from a base level of common truth. So those are a couple things that I want to talk about, are like ways that racism has gone beyond all those three milestones that I just mentioned, and how they've sort of added to the reason that we're seeing this disproportionate number of Black youth experiencing homelessness. And so I will just sort of talk a little bit about like these broader sort of systemic oppressions that all create this perfect storm for that massive percentage of MFP's clientele, being people of color. The first one I want to talk about is redlining. Or access to housing, and I don't just like people talk about California's housing crisis that we have today, and when they do that, they tend to leave out the historical background, the historical framework or foundation for what we're experiencing today. And there's I think you guys are going to do this more articulately than I will, but the redlining mixed with sort of like the generational wealth, and sort of talk about how that the access to those, the having to deal with redlining and not having the generational wealth that some of our white counterparts have, how that then funnels a lot of young Black people to MFP.
Sure, I'll be happy to kick off this topic. So I guess to give a background of what redlining was and some of the other racist housing practices, essentially, there were literally lenders and property owners back when they were trying to make the big push out of cities into suburbs, and moving people to having becoming homeowners. And really it's about creating workforces for factories and production. There were particular communities that they literally drew red line on the map around communities where Blacks could not buy any property outside of that outside of the red line. And there's places, Oakland, LA, across the state, where they literally would have housing reports that would say, oh, this is a colored, there's coloreds here. You don't want to buy property here because the property is going to be lower because there's the colored family in the neighborhood. And so they would be pushing people to buy outside of the non-Blacks or whites to buy outside of these areas. Along with that is in those red line communities, those folks didn't have access to loans for not only just to buy their property, but also for home improvement. So if you look at those communities and why a lot of them are blighted, it's because not only could they not leave those communities, they also couldn't get funding to upgrade their house, to upkeep their house. The second piece of that, when the fair housing, a couple other pieces of that, when we were talking about systems, a lot of people don't realize that the GI Bill, in which so many whites at the end of World War II came out of the military and were able to buy homes because the government, it was a government handout. The government said, here you go, here's money to buy a home. They had specific loan programs for families to buy homes that Blacks explicitly were not allowed to participate in. So Blacks did not get a GI Bill. We got the racist bill, get back in your place. Anyway, so these specific systems kept Blacks from achieving that wealth at a particular time, where if you look now, those folks that were in those suburbs were now able to finance college educations, finance businesses, etc. We did not have access to those funds explicitly by law, but from the government. So it wasn't like it was a person discriminating. Yeah, it was that, but the government actually had these policies in place. When you get to fast forward to the Fair Housing Act, and I believe it was 74, I could be wrong, but somewhere in there, the Fair Housing Act says you could no longer discriminate along race for rental or purchasing. So what these communities then did was they enacted single family zoning. So they made it extremely difficult to build anything but a house. And what the idea is that they didn't want lower income or Black, brown, other minorities to move into their communities, so they didn't have different income levels of housing options. So only if you could buy a home could you live in that community, right? But guess what? You're not going to get a loan. So how are you going to buy a home in that community? So single family zoning is actually a legacy of redlining and racist housing practices that has now plagued California today, because we can't be. In fact, most of the places where we have apartments, especially in our cities, are illegal to build apartments there. If those apartments fail, we couldn't even build an apartment to replace them. We only could build a single family home. That's why there's a big push in housing advocacy in different circles around dismantling single family zoning, especially in high opportunity areas, so that there's opportunities for different income levels be able to participate in some of these great neighborhoods.
Right, and I feel like when you have a community where there are a lot of people who don't have a lot of housing options, if there's a situation where a young person is not getting along with their family, or they've been kicked out or whatever, they don't have 4 or 5 other options of places to go and stay with other family members who have been able to buy homes and this, that, and the other. Or if they do have people that they could stay with, those people have their own kids, or they're taking care of their parents, or there's not the same level of, well, everybody has a 4-bedroom house with a backyard, so yeah, we'll just hop around until. So then these are the folks that because of all those practices, and those are generations and generations that those practices have been going on. And correct me if I'm wrong, Konstantin, but isn't the push right now to build more multi-family housing around transit area, that sort of trying to erase some of what that single family zoning has done? That's
exactly right. But I mean, that we could get on that subject.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want
to. Just because it's this weird fight between like a lot of equity folks that are worried that losing single family, like pushing for an end of single family zoning will accelerate gentrification and displacement. I'm not on that side of that argument. I think it can be done carefully in a way that can, but that's neither here nor there. But I think that, but to your point though, that creates a much exacerbated level of housing insecurity, where people just don't have housing options, where people are overcrowded in their homes. So because you don't have you haven't had that access to housing now, and this is, speaks to kind of the elevated levels of Blacks have 3.5 times higher of catching corona, because we're having to live in tighter spaces. So there's, like to your point, less options for, I'm going to go to my aunts or my uncles or somewhere else because we're all crowded in the same place.
Did anyone else wanted to jump in on the redlining or the sort of generational wealth element, or?
Kind of took us to an interesting connection between housing and then health. And when I think about that, coming from the farming space, there's a legacy in rural areas of this same kind of racist policy that kept us from accessing land. You know, between slavery and about 1920, Black folks were able to acquire a couple million, 16 to 18 million acres of land. And from that time to now, through other systemic problems, through Klan and police presence, through their neighbors kicking them off, through theft, through the USDA, making sure they weren't getting farm loans, we're down to 1 million acres of land as a race in this nation. Right now, 96% of farmland owners in America are white. And we talk about health and this real estate complex, our connection to land, which is the basis of everyone's health, has been severed. So we're not farmers, we're not connected to the land. We've been pushed into these places covered by concrete where we have to perform some function to get a sheet of paper to buy the thing that used to come for free out of the ground. So we've disconnected from the very source of our health and from freedom. I mean, that first promise to us post-slavery was, okay, we can give y'all 40 acres and a mule. And, you know, think about why that makes sense. In 40 acres, you got enough trees to potentially build a house if you're going to do it out of wood. If you're going to build a house out of earth, there's enough earth there to do that. There's enough area to dig some holes and find some water. You got a mule to help you with what back then they thought we needed to plow everything. So that was going to help you with that kind of labor. We had enough land to grow enough food to support ourselves and multi-generations. So that was the promise. That land equaled freedom. You know, back then there was another word for employment. They called it wage slavery. And that's what we got pushed into because we weren't able to have and hold on to productive land. So I think that's an interesting confluence of problems there. Access to space, health, access to the earth itself to maintain our true well-being and deep well-being. I think these are all interconnected problems.
That's actually a pretty good segue over into mental health and sort of how that affects one's ability to find housing, to maintain housing. I am always an advocate of therapy, of mental health, healthcare in the Black community. I feel like it's one thing that is not prioritized, and understandably so, because, you know, if you're struggling with, you know, basic financial needs, then psychotherapy sort of feels like something that's a little bit too ritzy, or it's just beyond your reach, or it's not something that Black people do, quote unquote. But I feel like as far as everything we've just discussed, there's these kind of albatrosses that we've been carrying around for generations, and it's leading to a breakdown in our mental health because, like you said, we don't have this connection to the land. We don't have this ability to sort of, we don't have as much ability to advance ourselves in society. So I just wanted to kind of get everyone's perspective on how mental health might be affecting everyone's access and ability to maintain housing.
I think it's I had a conversation last night with a bunch of brothers of mine, and one of them he's a preacher's kid, and he was talking about the religious context many of us, you know, have a legacy of coming up through. And he said that, you know, in his family and his environment, they never stressed therapy. He even said that, you know, in his context, in his particular Black community, therapy was kind of like a slap in Jesus's face. He said he grew up hearing that, you know, he had a problem, you take it to Jesus, give it to the Lord. And, you know, it was that was the ethic. And he was telling this story in pain because of the ways he's suffering right now, and basically expressing that just wasn't enough. And I think that we can own some of that as a people, owning that particular strategy and not accessing some of the other strategies that are available. Concerning land, that wasn't by choice. Our disconnection, land was we all know land is healing. We know the studies that say that the amount of trees in a neighborhood has an impact on the psychological well-being of the people living in that area. But for us, you know, the land was the scene of the crime in ways. And, you know, we tie our experience as a people in slavery to the land, which is unfortunate because it's the thing that's healing. I was in Hawaii and I met a brother on the street and he was looking for work. And I said, listen, I know a lot of farmers here. I bet I could ask around to see if we can get you some work. And he looked at me and said, man, we ain't slaves no more. I said, okay, so where are you thinking about applying? And this brother said, I'm going down to McDonald's to apply for a job. So in that story, you kind of see we're so disconnected from the thing that can really do us some good psychologically, mentally, emotionally. And it's very unfortunate. And our organization is going to try to fix that. We're going to try to get folks back in touch with the land and heal themselves from nature.
That's a really good point, Wayne. And, you know, I'm glad that you brought those studies up. I'd say to build on that, a big key part of the issue too is if you look at overall lack of access to good health systems in Black communities, right? We don't have the number of hospitals. We're just talking about basic body care, right? We're not getting the reasons why our health outcomes are so much poor. We don't have access to good health systems. We don't have access to a variety of doctors. We don't have access to healthy food and nourishment because of food deserts. And that's the basic elements. Mental health has long been thought of as, I think now it's starting to come into prominence as something that is critically important for maintaining well-being and survival, right? And it's starting to get almost as equivalent to your traditional medical treatments, but that's still relatively new as a society. And then when you put that, you juxtapose that on what's happening in Black and brown communities, but let's talk about especially in Black communities, where we already we have inferior healthcare options. That extra mental health is seen as, you know, just something that is not even part of your everyday discourse because you don't even have that option. It's not even something that even comes to thought. No one's messaging you and telling you, hey, you might need to see someone, a counselor, to talk through some of these issues. We don't even have that kind of access in those communities. There's very little access. The times that we have them are something usually around criminal justice system, is where we get that first comes in, and we know how that looks. Not great. And so it's also, again, part of these systems of racism where we don't have that level of access in our communities. So we can't even have that conversation. It's hard to talk about mental health when your house is on fire, right? Or when you're starving, or you don't have a job, or you have housing insecurity, you know, all these things that are like in your face. I survived today. It's hard to then take a step. You don't have the opportunity to take a step back and say, how can I heal myself? And I think that's also a big piece of the lack of mental health in our communities, because it reminds me of a time I was working with this education nonprofit here in LA, and we supported teachers to find solutions for better outcomes in their classrooms, specifically in LAUSD. And I was in his class. He was about maybe like 3rd or 4th grade, and something like that. And he was a special ed class. And the thing that stuck with me was he told me, before I can get to even teaching anybody, I can't teach anything until I put the fire out of my classroom. No one's going to learn anything if my class is on fire. So before he can even get to the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, he has to actually help these kids manage themselves, their emotional. And these kids are going through PTSD because of what they're walking through, what they're waking up in, what they're walking through to get to school. They're already traumatized before they even walk into campus. And so these are the kind of things that are going to that these kids, you're talking elementary school kids, are already starting off with these mental health issues because of their environment. So it's all of it, it all leads back to these systems of oppression that keep people down, and they all feed upon themselves. If you can't get a job, you can't get food to eat, you don't have a great place to live, you know, there's violence in your community, there's violence in your home. You know, when you factor that out, damn, shit is hard, right? And this is what our kids are coming through. And so now you put that with young people coming of age, the most difficult of times, right? Like, we all know how hard it is to be 14, 15, 21. I mean, that shit was difficult. Excuse my language. It was difficult times. So for anybody, if you're a wealthy kid, it's difficult. With a strong family structure, you're still going to be going through it. I know, I have a 21-year-old. I know he's going through it. And he has a great family structure. So you put someone that doesn't have that, man, the deck is stacked against them. What do we expect for them to do? So,
I think that's well said, Con.
Yeah, very well said.
All right, go ahead.
No, Tony, I was actually going to ask you, and I can vamp for a second if you need to pull these up. But like, what are the statistics on my MFP youth who have mental health issues that are, I guess it's a two-part question. A, that are diagnosed, or B, like, what percentage have you guys witnessed that are probably undiagnosed, or are you able to guess in that regard?
So we do have a question where we ask you kind of like, do you have any mental health that you would like us to assist you with? We do believe that many of youth are not necessarily reporting that they have mental health. So the number is actually pretty low compared to what we think the number actually is. I think the number is probably around like 10%, but locally the number is 24% for youth who are experiencing homelessness, who also have some type of mental health. And so we do believe that that number is higher, and based off of our experience, we know that that number is higher. Right.
So yeah, I guess, and this goes back to education, but it also goes back to, you know, making this more of a priority in the Black community. Making mental health more of a priority in the Black community, which is, you know, when I grew up in Delaware, and, you know, it was pretty evenly mixed. I'd say about 60-40 white to Black. So like, and a lot of the white kids I knew were on Ritalin. They were diagnosed with ADHD at the earliest onset of any sort of behavioral difference from what is the perfectly behaved child. They're instantly like, let's get you checked out, let's get you medicated, let's get you a tutor, let's get you whatever it is you need. And so how do we get obviously, like Konstantin said, we don't have necessarily the same access to those health systems, but how do we get into the mind of Black America that these are things that we should be chasing? These are things that we should be seeking out. These are things that, because it's either we go there, we figure out a way to find doctors to diagnose our kids with these, so that we can say to the teacher, hey, he's got this, and so this might be responsible for some of his behavior, versus here's my kid, you know, he's perfectly, you know, he's the picture of perfect mental health, and then he's in detention all the time, or he's getting suspended or whatever, because they aren't taking into account whatever his mental health issues are. So does anyone have any thoughts on how to get that to be a bigger priority for Black people?
I think.
Oh, sorry, Wayne.
Go ahead.
Would it be okay to jump in here? Yeah. So I think there's, like any system, right? Mental health is a system, and it's a big one at this point. And it's a concept that was influenced initially by white men. And the idea that our mental health system is also a system that is it's touched by racism just like any other system, right? And so I think part of it, and on top of that, mental health, it's rooted in pathology. So part of it is mental health needing to change, not to be about what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you, right? And what's happened to people of color and to Black people where they are struggling. Like, that's real, and we don't always talk about it. We continue to pathologize mental health. And my experience, not necessarily professionally, but with Black friends that I know, a lot of you being on the panel, is Black people are talking about mental health. They're talking about it all the time. They're just not using the dominant culture of mental health that, that has been influenced by white people. So I think part of it is even just, I think what we kind of put forward as mental health from a dominant culture perspective is really different. And I also, around homelessness, right? Like to Konstantin's point, at my friend's place, our whole model, right, is about like, come in and get yourself some food, get a little breath so that you can even start to imagine some of these higher level things. I love, Wayne, your concept of like deep well-being. Whew, right? Like that's what this is about, that depth of well-being. And it starts when your basic needs are taken care of and you even have the space to think about things. But from like a trauma place, we are always advocating that trauma, most of our young people enter into homelessness having already had experiences of a lot of trauma. And then homelessness is a trauma. And I think if we can start applying that frame, racism and existing in this world as a Black person is a trauma that's endured every second of every day. And so what changes in the mental health conversation if we really start appreciating that? So I think those are the thoughts that come up for me around mental health.
I think that's a great point. I think we do well to just presume that all Black people are traumatized and have and have to deal with PTSD from being Black, or post-traumatic slavery syndrome, as Joy the Clown talks about. I think it would be safe to say that is a universal experience for us. I remember when Con was talking about kids in 14, 15, 16, and I started thinking back to what were normal experiences for me at that age. I lived in an environment where the racism was internalized, and folks like me in my neighborhood hated themselves so much that they would go out and kill the person that looked the most like them for significance and out of pain. It was a lot of violence in where I grew up. If it wasn't that violence I was experiencing police violence. I mean, the first time one of my friends in school, in junior high school, was killed was in 8th grade, and it was a girl. So when my brother and I went to go see her body at the wake, I saw the hole in her forehead they tried to fill with clay. In 8th grade, you're not supposed to see that. And that leaves damage. By the time I successfully got out of Los Angeles and made it to college, I remember sitting around in the dining commons with my buddies, and then somebody would start to give a story about something that happened with a police officer. And that person would finish saying what he was saying, and then it would bounce across the table, and somebody else would give a story. And the next person would give a story. And the next person would give a story. And then we realized, like, wow, you've had a shotgun to your head? Everybody at the table. We reverberated these horrifying experiences. And I asked one of my brothers last night, who was with me at a very horrible experience we had here in Los Angeles in the marina, if he had ever had therapy about it. And he told me never. He tried to talk to one person about it, and they tried to take him down some other route, not really paying attention to the reality of his experience. And I thought that was, he had an attempt. He made an attempt, and the professional didn't acknowledge his real experience. The police broke my back in 1995. I was a kid. I was 18 years old. So when I went to get therapy in Santa Barbara, the first doctor I went to said, "How did this happen?" So I begin to tell him I'm in pain. I begin to tell him my story. And the doctor looks at me and says, "Okay, so it's a football injury," and goes on. He completely disacknowledges what I was experiencing. And at 18, all I wanted was to be understood and to be believed. And that was the experience I had with a professional. So I think if we do well to just say, look, we're all damaged. We do well to start celebrating our psychologists who go into this field, lift them up. We do well to take advantage of every opportunity to see somebody. We do well to get folks who are starting to empathize with us to hear that we need to be believed. And I think that's finally starting to happen more broadly. I think that's a very good thing, because we definitely need some help. I think about my brother. I don't believe he's ever really recovered from some of the things we've experienced. And I see it, and my friends see it. And I see the way he responds to what's happening right now, the way he's triggered by these videos. I honestly, I still have yet to watch the whole George Floyd video. I stopped watching these videos back. I think Sandra Bland might be the last time I said, that's it. That's it. I can't take it. I can't even see it. If it comes up on my screen, I'm flying past it, trying to get past it because I can't see it. And one of my friends told me, "Yo, you are messed up, man. You're messed up." if that's your response, I can't even look at it. The level of damage I'm experiencing, I don't even really talk to anybody about. So I think we do well to just say it across the board, we are damaged, we need help. And if there's a, I mean, look, there's a conversation right now about repair, about reparations, you know, build in some sort of universal mental health care for Black folks moving forward. That'd be a good thing to add.
Yeah, I think that would be a really great start. And to your point, Wayne, like we've sort of had to be that for each other. Like your example about everybody sitting around the table sharing their experiences. You know, obviously that's helpful as far as like not feeling like you're the only one that has had these horrible experiences. But you know, none of us are trained mental health professionals. And to your other point, even sometimes the ones that are like trained mental health professionals will still completely disregard whatever your experience was to no gain of their own, which is what I don't understand about that. But I guess, you know, having these conversations more and more, which Aaron, I'm glad to hear you say that people are talking about that. And I'm noticing that more too. Whether I'm talking to Black friends of mine who are more religious or not religious, that they're starting to shirk some of that stigma of like, if you're not giving your problems to Jesus, then it's a slap in the face to him. So I feel like we are definitely making progress. And I think that's something we can all do on a very grassroots level is to continue those conversations in our circles and to, you know, I've been in therapy for like 6 years. Like I won't shut up about it. Like I will scream from the mountaintops, like go find you, like meet with a couple different therapists like that. And that's the one thing that you said too, Wayne, that triggered something with me. Was I've heard a lot of people say, I went to go meet with this therapist and he sucked and I couldn't. And so therapy is not for me. And I actually had that same experience where I went to a guy and he was just not a good fit. It's like dating essentially. Like you have to date around to a couple different doctors, you know, go to one session and a couple different people, see who gets you, see who you feel like really believes you. Also, one of the people I met with felt like too much of a pushover and like they weren't going to challenge me enough. So I was like, no, I need somebody that I can go a few rounds with, you know, like that's sort of part of what I would love for us to all be encouraging each other to seek out. And then to Aaron's point, like I wonder, is there a way to get some more like diversity training is the wrong word, but just more training on how to speak to different cultural experiences in a way that's going to be helpful to a client. I don't know the answer to that, so I don't know if you know, you, Aaron, or Toni, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't know the exact answer, right? But I think it's twofold, right? It's making sure that this is like the educational access issue, that folks of color who want to be doing the mental health work can get the education and the license that requires. And that's a big other system, right? Like right now, to get licensed as a helping professional, you can't have a criminal history. There's this, that, and the other. Like that's got to change. And there's work being done on that issue. So that people with lived experience are in these roles, right? That's another privilege and access issue, just like all the other privilege and access issues. So I think that's part of it. And then I think, you know, and this is definitely happening, but for, you know, white professionals like myself, to make sure that we are required, not encouraged, but required to have whatever education is going to make us more, at least, you know, the empathy training and all of that. You know, I'm one of those people that, to me, it's Maya Angelou who said that, right? People won't remember what you say, but they'll remember how you made them feel. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, that is so much the core of therapy or counseling is can you sit with someone who can just bear witness to your pain? And I think that what we see time and time again is there are lots of white folks who can't actually bear witness to your pain. And that has to change on a fundamental level.
Go ahead.
Go back to Aaron's comment about talking about a lot of homelessness stemming from trauma, like as kind of almost a causal of that catapults young people into homelessness because they are victims of this trauma. And only reason I want to just revisit that because the trauma, the trauma itself, and not just the external forces, but also the internal family trauma also is part of the legacy of racism. It's that legacy of I have to, you know, especially among Black families, and I bet a lot of y'all, especially older ones, know about this, that you know, spare the rod, spoil the child. I got to punish you and make sure you're obedient to make sure, because because I love you. If you look at a white girl the wrong way, your ass could end up dead. And so that's the history of racism, and us actually, the violence even in our own families and homes that has led to this, that ultimately leads to this trauma that kids are experiencing, that they like, I got to get out of here, right? And so I think that's an important aspect of it, is also we have to look at our own family structure and evolve to out of this. But we also have to, but to be able to do that, we have to look at where it comes from, right? And I know, you know, my grandparents were Southern, you know, and so they beat the shit out of their kids. That's just what it was, right? And to a certain degree, that's how my parents thought what they had to do, because they didn't want me getting caught out there either by the police or somewhere else, where, you know, being able to have that discipline to be able to survive in a terrorist, in the terror of being a Black person in this country, right? Like, you are subject to being terrorized at any moment. And so you had to have that discipline instilled in you. You couldn't be free. You couldn't be free to express yourself. You couldn't be free to laugh and play and be wild. You had to be beaten down into conformity. Otherwise, you could die. And so we have to also look at that. That's that history and legacy of racism that is a direct result. So it's not just we as Black people have to be better about talking about it. We have to also be looking at, again, the system of racism that has led to this place. And so that's, you know, that gets us to some of these, and you can't be too different. You can't be too, so, you know, that and then in our reliance on religion, and some of how that, you know, how that conflicts with, you know, people being free and wanting to be themselves, right? And a lot of, and you know, I don't know the statistics. I'll let Toni or Aaron talk about it, but a lot of our homeless youth are LGBTQ plus folks, right? Because they've been kicked out of their house because the Lord said that being gay is evil. So we can't have that in my house. You got to get out with that, right? And so we're putting our own kids and babies out in the street because we can't accept them for who they are, because it's been beaten down. We've been beaten down to the point where we have to fit in this narrow place, this narrow description of who we are, because if we step outside of that, it could be fatal. And so we have to grow out of that. And that's part of the systems of racism that keeps us in mental slavery beyond just the physical oppression that we experience as well.
Yeah, and I feel like because of that reason, it's very easy to explain away that internal racism, because it's like, it's a protection. It's a defense mechanism. If I don't limit severely who I am, whether it's, you know, just as a Black person or as an LGBTQ plus person, like, then the world will be exponentially more dangerous for me than it is for anybody else. So you raised an excellent point, Konstantin, which is how do we get our families to shake off some of the negative things that they've been taught, that, again, were defense mechanisms, and we all understand where they come from, but how do we get that to stop being passed down? I know a lot of my friends who have kids now do not physically punish them nearly as much as their parents were. So it seems to be getting less severe from generation to generation, but they're still, it's interesting because my parents didn't physically reprimand me too often. But I did, you know, when I turned 16, got to talk about, you know, if a cop pulls you over, here's exactly what you have to do. And I was like, and we had never been like, you know, there wasn't a lot of racial violence that was going on around us growing up. So I was like, what are you talking about? Like, they're cops. Like if I'm speeding, they'll give me a ticket and then I go home, and then, so having that sort of, and that's the scary version. That's the adult version. The younger kid version is like, you can't, when we get into the store, you can't run around and act crazy because it could potentially put us in a dangerous situation. So when you're sort of told from, and then you see white kids doing the exact same thing that you were just told not to do and not facing any repercussions for it. So that constant, I think, Wayne, it was your point of trauma that is just sort of builds upon each other. That constant trauma of, I'm not offered the freedom or the luxury to be different or to be loud or to be myself the way that I see other people doing it. And that sort of feeding into this, well, what chance do I have to be to become actualized if I'm constantly just subverting every part of myself? Sorry, that wasn't a question. I probably should have framed it as one. Yeah, but I guess it is heartening, though, to your point, Konstantin, that does seem to be getting progressively better from generation to generation. Along those lines, I know there was, we talked about policing and sort of how that just the whole criminal justice system in general sort of can set us back in just awful ways, as we've been seeing lately. So I don't know, what do you guys, like the defund the police movement has kind of been gaining more steam lately. And it's something that a lot of people hear and they're like, wait a minute, that sounds a little extreme. Like, with who do you call when something bad goes on? But like, the way I understand it is, well, I'll let you guys speak on it a little bit more. Pros, cons. What are your thoughts on defund the police?
Well, so I've heard different kind of variations of this, and I think one of the variations that I've heard is completely defunding the police and kind of reverting to more of a mental health, I guess, program where we would call them social workers to kind of help de-escalate situations. And I think there's this misconception that people who are in the helping profession do not have their own biases or are not racist. And so I think we want to run to them to be our savior, and we're kind of demonizing the police. And I believe that there are police who are racist. There are police who definitely need to step down. But I don't believe that every single police officer is racist and, has some vendetta against Black people or brown people. And I believe that we see the same thing happening in mental health, and it's just not talked about. We see people in mental health who are biased. We see them who perpetrate racism within the system and individually with the people that they're working with. And so I think because we don't talk about it, we feel like we can find some type of savior within them, and we can't. So I think that the police institution needs to be reformed. And I personally don't know what that looks like yet, but I think this idea of completely defunding them and running to mental health workers is not the way to go. I think we need a mixture. I like the idea of funding programs, so taking some of that money and then funding educational programs, funding recreational programs, and trying to get to the root cause of racism, absolutely. But this idea that the mental health profession can save us, I think is a myth. And I think that's something that we really need to deal with, because racism and bias is just as strong in the mental health profession as it is with police. They just don't have guns to shoot us. So that's something that I think we really need to pay attention to and focus on.
And I think one of the things, because you hear it around, and I think there's a lot of misconception too around what defund the police even really means. And, for some, it's, we're talking about disbanding police. And then for others, it's more about divestment. And it's really about making sure our budgets reflect our values. And so what we're seeing in a lot of, like, well, let's talk about, LA, where 42% of the county budget is going towards police systems, the police, the DA, and the probation departments. So, and I think the idea is that why are we putting so much money in militarizing and over policing our neighborhoods and communities when that money can be well spent? And why are we having police be also social workers, be also crisis counselors, right? There's so many times that an armed police presence isn't really necessary or should be the last resort, as opposed to trying something else that is actually beneficial and moving money into programs that can actually help alleviate the root causes of why this crime actually exists. And so I think that's where the discussion needs to be around. It also depends on department to department. Now, there's also been case studies where, like, for example, Camden, New Jersey, in 2012 disbanded their police department and started over. Now they have a police, but they reimagined it and hired and changed their hiring practice, changed their whole operation. So now it's one of the safest communities in the country. Crime has dropped over 50%. And the community and the police work hand in hand. You'll see that the police were out there protesting with the community members, and you see that in places. And I think we have to be clear to that there's not like a one size fits all solution, but we also have to look seriously about where a lot of even progressive cities or progressive, the same thing with LA, Los Angeles. I think something like over 54% of their discretionary budget was going to the police. And so we have to look at where we're putting our money in different options instead of just armed police response for every situation, because we're talking about people that have been trained for 6 weeks now are given the power of life, judge, jury, and executioner, and responding to things that they have no possible way to be able to deal with. And even a bias, if you have a choice between a biased mental health professional and a biased police officer, I'm going to take that mental health professional because they're not going to also execute. They don't have the option of executing me, right? And so I do think that and I really appreciate Tony's point that part of that discussion has to be, how are we training folks that are how are we training our mental health professionals? How are we training our police officers? How are we making sure that they are not injecting their own implicit bias, that they have cultural relevancy and cultural understanding? How is that training? And that's money that can be taken out of buying police tanks and more tear gas and rubber bullets and new ways to beat and oppress communities of color. We can put that money towards training the people that actually, so they can get out and do the work effectively. And I think that's where the conversation is meant to go. And that might look different from city to city, but I do think that we have to be careful because we do still need public safety officers. I don't agree that we don't need police at all, because if somebody's running up in your crib, you still want to call the police, right? That's just what it, and so we have to be careful. There's an active shooter out somewhere, you're not going to call the mental health professional, right? You need an armed response in that. And so there are situations where you do require police, but it can be done in a responsible and much more holistic manner. And they can be part of the community and of the community, as opposed to the oppressive force subjugating the community.
Right. And go ahead, Wayne.
I like Khan's idea of the way he framed that, funding our values. And I think there's room to defund more than just the police. There's room to this whole criminal justice system, in the last 40 years here in California, they've built 20 prisons, but 1 university, and the cost associated with housing a prisoner is $100,000 cost for a year. The cost associated with taking care of a student is $10,000. So we have our values are really messed up when it comes to criminal justice all around. I think there's room to do a whole lot there.
Toni and Aaron, can you guys speak to how the young people at MFP, what their experiences have been with the police? Because I imagine just since experiencing homelessness, are they reporting that the police are just kind of like casually, hey, you got to move or you can't be here? Is it taking their property? Is it like how are they reporting that they're being treated? And also, is there a disparity between how some of your Black versus non-Black young people are being treated by the police?
I'll start, but Toni, please jump in. I mean, yeah, I think overall, the criminalization of homelessness is real. And so that is experienced by all of our young people. And, you know, and that's not to say, and my friend's place has, you know, we try really hard to have collaborative relationships with our local law enforcement. And we're pretty successful, but that doesn't always transpire into how young people are treated on the street. You know, my friend's place very much recognizes that a lot of our young people have had significant trauma at the hands of law enforcement. So when we have to call law enforcement, which we try not to do, but sometimes we do have to, or when law enforcement comes here, we are very clear to do our best to have law enforcement wait outside if they have to come inside, so that we can go around and tell everyone there's officers in the house. And if we know that's triggering. Mm-hmm. And if they need to leave, try to make that happen. You know, I think, and we have also seen a few of our, again, like these are the officers assigned to kind of working with folks experiencing homelessness. They're allies. Like we see that time and time again. We know that there have been officers who have shown up in court for young people that they have relationships with to try to advocate. So I think it's a little bit of everything, but I think, you know, to Konstantin's point, when your law enforcement is of the community and part of the problem solving around homelessness, that's something very different. But as a general idea, the young people that we're working with have had some pretty negative law enforcement experiences. And I'll be honest, my only interaction with law enforcement is here at my friend's place, and they have not been awesome interactions. And that is someone in positional authority at a nonprofit as a white woman. So the idea that there is some structural issues for that system need to take a look at. And I also agree with Toni, right? Like the potential for racism and implicit bias are in every system. So we can't just replace one system with another system and call it good. That's problematic. But Toni, would you add anything more to our young people's experience with law enforcement?
I mean, honestly, I think you hit the nail on the head. I was just going to mention how I think their reaction when police are in the building is pretty antagonistic. Like I think most of our youth have had really bad experiences with the police. And I think there have been times when youth have been like, I just need to leave. Like I need to go outside. I don't want to be here. Even if they're on the other side of the room and won't have any interaction with the police, I think just being in their presence is triggering enough. And so to see that, I personally have not had a bad experience with the police. And so I can walk past them. I think in more recent weeks, I've had more anxiety around police, but that wasn't something that I had in the past. So to see that, there must have been a lot of triggering and negative experiences that they've had with the police.
And that really goes back to how we are, you know, spending our money on when we're talking about fund, even as we're talking about how we're funding our police, right? What are we spending our, even within that bucket, what are we spending our money, our dollars on? What kind of training are we giving officers so that they can deal with these situations and not, you know, and not only how the training, but the accountability systems that we have in place, right? Our things like national databases, things like, you know, not allowing cops that have abused their powers back on the force without some type of, you know, reconditioning, or they just got to go. And so we really, you know, how are we even preparing these people that we're giving all this authority and power to? And then and then to expand that, we're talking about reforming the system. How are we preparing the people? To Toni's point, we really have to be looking at how are we going, if we're looking at changing, we got to also be looking at how are we preparing those that are going to fill these needs that that shouldn't be handled by police. How are we preparing them to step into that role? And it can't just be ad hoc and just, oh, they got it, but it has to be very thoughtful, very planned, and in a way that we're not going to perpetuate the problem, but we're actually providing them the scaffolding to be successful in that endeavor. It's easy, you can't just throw people into the fire without building the scaffolding for them to be successful do that work.
And one thing to Konstantin's point, what I would like to see is community policing. Like, you need to know the community. So the first time you go into the community can't be when you're responding to a call. You know, how do you build relationships with the community members? How, like, why aren't we creating opportunities for police to be volunteering, to be going into schools, not to police the students at the school, but to be involved, to get to know the students, to build relationships with people? Because I think those relationships can help to dismantle some of the stereotypes and schemas that we have about certain groups of people. So if you have these relationships, then you're able to say, okay, Black men aren't all scary because I have relationships with this Black man, I have a relationship with this young boy, and he's a great artist, and this one plays basketball, and this one is a great singer. And I think those relationships can help to dismantle that. So how do we make sure that a part of this reforming of this police institution involves engagement in the community, not just when you're responding to a call, but so much more than that? You know, there needs to be way much more time when police are in the community engaging with people outside of when they're trying to enforce rules.
Yeah, and Toni, I think that also works on the other side too, which is like Black kids can be like, oh, not all cops are scary. That guy, you know, gave me a ride home when the bus left earlier, and then that lady, like, you know, helped me with my homework, and after, because we were, whatever, played basketball together. Like, there used to be police athletic leagues all the time. I don't know what happened to that program, but I do remember that being a kind of a truce in a certain way for a number of years that did exactly what you said, introduced them, made the people being policed and the police feel like, oh, these are not scary people. These are people who are part of our community. These are people that we get to interact with, not have to interact with. So yeah, I wonder what that looks like. I love the idea of, like, you know, having police officers do if you're not a resident of the neighborhood that you're policing, then you should be involved with a certain level of service, or of, you know, of anything, whatever it is, or, you know, meeting with nonprofit organizations to be like, hey, how can we better serve your, you know, the people, the clients that you serve at this nonprofit. Because I feel like, you know, having them talk to Aaron for 5 minutes, they'd be able to understand, oh, here's how what we do terrifies these young people. So if we want to be able to approach these young people and not have them be so terrified of us, maybe we could alter our approach a little bit. So I think that's a really great idea. I don't know how that gets started, but yeah. And also, I as a TV and film writer, I'm part of the conversation that's happening in Hollywood right now is that, you know, the studios and television producers have to not put the images out there that, like, Black people are these big scary monsters that are going to come get you, because that's sort of, unfortunately there are so many people in America who don't have access to Black people in their regular lives. So the only access that they do have is through media. And so it's incumbent upon us being Hollywood, to not just be putting out there those kinds of stories. And so that's something that I definitely will be more conscious of in the future, and will encourage my colleagues to do the same. So yeah, it seems like this is a giant multi-front war. Like we've talked about several different areas in which, like, large structural change is needed for the very simple result of Black people being seen as equal, as human, as, like, worthy of the same justice and the same respect and the same access to opportunity that everybody else has. So, I mean, that's a really, it sounds like an incredibly daunting task, but I feel like in this moment right now, when white people are listening, it's time to really share our stories with them and our emotions with them and our traumas with them, and not to coddle them, and not to hold back or worry about them being overwhelmed or being, I don't know, shocked or you know, not trying to protect their feelings in any given way, because it's not, then we're not getting our authentic ourselves over. So, like, and that's something that I've been working hard to do myself. So and we're kind of hitting the end of our time here. So I want to wrap up with a question about allyship along those lines. Like, what, and this is, I understand that this is a little bit different for every person, every Black person. Like, we all have different ideas of what the perfect white ally should be and how they should behave. So I guess I would put the question to you guys: what is the perfect ally look like in your mind?
So for me, I have multicultural relationships. I have friends who are white, I have friends who are Asian. And what I have seen that has been super supportive and a great sign of allyship is that they're willing to walk through life with me. So beyond the George Floyds and the Breonna Taylors, we have an ongoing relationship where we talk and we get to know each other and we go out to lunch. I don't want someone who I haven't talked to in a year to reach out to me after George Floyd died and ask how I feel about it. Like, I don't want you to use me for information. I don't want you to use me to try to get woke or try to understand what's happening in the Black community. I just want you to be my friend. I want you to be in relationship with me, and that will come up out of that relationship. I'll talk to you about how I feel about George Floyd out of my own comfort, because you've been in my life and you've been consistently a part of my life. So I think for me, what I don't want is for people to jump in and out of my life when it's convenient for them, when they're trying to gather information, but they feel uncomfortable to ask other people who are in their lives. So like, oh, well, Toni's Black, so let me ask her what she thinks about the situation. No, don't ask me unless we've already had relationships and we've already kind of been in conversations around things, because then I feel used and exploited. And that makes me feel very uncomfortable. And I won't give you any information anyways about how I feel, because that's very personal. So I think for me, what I would like to see in allyship is to walk through life with me, to be with me through the ups and the downs, and to support me as I fight. So I don't need you to lead the fight. I need you to support me as I lead the fight. I don't want you to take over, but I want you to support me as I lift my own voice. Don't speak for me. Allow me to speak for myself and allow me to amplify my own voice. And if you have a platform, then amplify my voice, but don't speak for me. So that's what I would like to see as it relates to allyship.
Yeah, Chuck, I want to say thank you for asking that question. I think it's important and to get different responses. And I want to contrast a little bit with Toni's perspective. And there was a moment a few years ago where a volcano went off in Hawaii, and I spent time on the island, off and on the Big Island, and the volcano went off, and I immediately started thinking about folks who were going to be impacted by that happening. And some of those folks I hadn't talked to for a year or two. Some of those folks I hadn't been keeping up with lately. But I had a moment where, whoa, I think they're going to be really impacted by this. And there's some things I hadn't thought about. And I immediately wanted to reach out to them because they were going to be touched by this thing that was happening. I wanted to see, was there any way I could be of assistance in this moment that's got to be difficult for you? I'm becoming aware of a reality for you that I never think about. I'm becoming aware of that I haven't really been good enough of a friend and kept up. And so I took that opportunity to reach out to those folks of mine who were impacted in a way that I was becoming aware of. And so I feel a little bit differently about that. I invite folks to call me and talk to me about how I'm doing and ask me how I'm doing. I invite it. And and if you say, what does a good ally or a great ally, a white person as an ally look like for me? I think it takes a couple forms. Number one, I think it's important, and I see this happening already, an acknowledgement of the reality you're becoming aware of, I think is important. Second, an openness to learning and an invitation to learn. I think sometimes that call out to me might just be that. Could you tell me more about this? Could you tell me about your experience? I want to hear what your experience is. That openness to learning, I think, is important. Then I think third, a modeling for other whites in your community that you can be open, you can be confused, you can say, I don't know what to say, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. You can model for the folks around you that it's okay to be uncomfortable about it and weird about it, and be, it's okay to ask for patience because you're going to say the wrong thing and come from ignorance in a lot of ways. And I think lastly, what will make for a good ally for me is someone that commits to repair. We see the empathy, I see the openness, I see the willingness to learn, I see the acknowledgement, and I love all of it. I see the little kids out there with signs. I'm driving in my neighborhood and I see white folks pointing at me, telling me I matter. I see all that, and I hope that continues, and you be committed to repair. Work with us to repair these things deeply. The wounds are deep. We need to go all the way in and figure out really what's wrong, and then figure out how to repair it, and then commit to repairing it. The state is willing to spend $100,000 a year on folks who look like me for punishment. Well, let's start spending some money on upliftment. on our wellness. And I think that's what makes for a good ally for me. Thank you, Chuck, for that question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And just, you can hear the difference in Tony's and Wayne's responses, and that's a natural tension, right? And also I think it's thinking about in terms of, looking at personal allies, people within your circle, your friend group, but also being a good ally as a white person that is becoming aware of what's going on and wanting to do better. And so I think, from a personal standpoint, I hear Tony's point, because sometimes, in the midst of this, you get that, you start to grow tired of constantly checking in, right? Especially I work in social. A lot of people know I work in the work, and so they, hey, how you doing? Everything okay? Or they want to reach out and talk about it, or what should I do? How can I do it? What can I, And after a while, that does get taxing. It does wear on you. It's like, now, not only do I have to deal with my shit, now I got to try to help you deal with your newfound realization of what's going on, and the evils in the world, right? So to me, in that moment, reach out and say, hey, how you doing? I know this has to be challenging for you. I want to appreciate that. I want to appreciate that love, because that's caring as a human being, right? And just saying, hey, how you doing? I know this shit is rough. Is there anything can I be helpful? What can I do anything for you? Right? But don't reach out and ask me what I should do, because go on social media, man. There's about 25 different posts every single day to find out, with tons of writing, what to do if you want to be a white ally. As told by white, talk to each other. Black, it's kind of like, it can't be that, I don't need you to talk to me about racism. Like, as Black folks, I know about it. I live it every single day. I don't have to worry. It's not a concept for me. It's a life that I have to live every single waking moment. And if I ever forget about it, something will slap me in the face and remind me real quick, right? Talk to your white peers about it. Talk to your uncle and your friends, and so that's the from the impersonal point, right? A point of view is that reach out, find out how I'm doing, show me love, say, hey, can I roll with you to a protest? I'm cool. Yes, I'm down with that, right? But don't ask me how do I learn more? What can I do? Don't sit there and act like, oh, I don't know what to do, especially in this moment, because there's so much information out there. If you truly care and you truly want to be an ally, you can find that information. Go get it. That's the first step. Educate yourself. And there's so much information out there to do it. Go do that. But I think on a broader scale, being a true ally, one, is that educating yourself. And then it's also, we don't need white folks to talk to Black folks about racism. We need white folks to talk to white folks about racism, because that's the problem. They're the ones that are perpetuating the systems that are keeping us oppressed for the last 450 years. Pick your system, right? And so those conversations need to be happening there. And it needs to be dedicated. It means that you can no longer just kind of laugh off when your racist uncle says some off-color ridiculous comment, or you can't ignore it. Oh, that's just him, I'm gonna let that go. No, address it. In moments, explain to your kids the real story of racism in this country, so that they come up with a new understanding of what it means to be Black in this country, and the systems that have kept us oppressed for all these centuries. Get out on the front lines, get your skin in the game, right? I want it all. One of the things that made me feel that in this moment's a little different. I think we were talking about it a little bit before we jumped on, went live, is that you start to see more white folks put skin in the game, right? When I'm out protesting and the police are running up and I hear them say, okay, white women, jump in front of the Black folks, lock arms and protect them. That's the kind of shit that I want to see, right? Put your bodies, because usually it's our Black bodies that are getting beaten, broken, and terrorized. Put your bodies in there in that harm's way, that's not going to erase what's happened, but that's putting skin in the game, right? You're out there putting your body in harm's way because to address this system of terror and oppression that's been happening, right? And so, I want to spend all the money, buy Black owned, have those conversations. And I'm not so naive to not recognize that a lot of this is, the kind of, there is an element of fad culture, right? This is it's so cool. It's cool to almost be Black Lives Matter, right? And so understanding that, but hell, I'll take it because that's helping spread the word. It's permeating. Some of that's going to permeate subconscious. So yes, get out there, have your kids out there with signs, spend money, promote Black-owned businesses, say Black Lives Matter, say it over and over and over and over again, sing it from the motherfucking mountaintops. Excuse my language, but stay at it. Let's keep it going. I want it to go as long as we possibly can. Videotape when you see things wrong, when you see police acting wrong, when you see these systems playing out, when you see the white homeowner come out and accost Black kids because they're, hey, what are you doing in this neighborhood, right? Which we see some of these videos going around. Videotape it, document it, put it out there. Keep up the pressure because it takes all of that. You need the people in the streets to be able to soften the ground for the people that are working on policy or working on laws or working on systems to be able to push radical ideas forward. And now we're in a great place where because of all this energy and momentum and just awareness, where we actually are, and I'm starting to see that filter down to where we actually can see systemic changes in laws and adjustments to how we are operationalizing racism in this country, we can start the process of change. We got a long way to go. It's not going to be tomorrow. It's not going to be in the next decade. It took 450 years to build these systems. It ain't going to happen overnight, right? But we have an opportunity now to push the ball forward further than we have ever. And let's keep that pressure up. Let's keep talking about it. Let's keep educating yourselves. Keep talking to each other, and keep getting your skin in the game.
I think that was a great point, and I'll answer the question myself too. I probably should have answered first, given you guys a minute to think. But the example that you gave, Konstantin, about like white women jumping in front of the Black protesters and linking arms, like that is the polar opposite of the Amy Cooper situation, which is these women at these protests are recognizing that their whiteness can be a shield instead of a target. Like they're weaponizing their whiteness for good and not for evil. I think that is an absolute brilliant point about like getting your skin in the game, really being invested. Toni, what you were talking about the actually, I think you guys both mentioned this, was when people come to you as allies and they're like, what can I do? That's such a broad question. Like, I'm a writer, and so like I get asked oftentimes like, hey, how do I become a screenwriter in Hollywood? And I'm like, it's a really big question. Like if you'd come with a little bit more just like education on like, hey, so I looked up this, I looked up this law, this defund the police thing. I'm kind of getting into that. I looked up things that I can do to support Black businesses. So like what do you think is the stronger avenue for me to take on this? So I'm talking to white allies now. Like if you want to make your questions more targeted, then it's easier for us to guide you without getting exhausted by feeling like we have to educate you on everything. And it's also, I think, Wayne, you said this, which is like, say up front, look, I'm here to be an ally. I'm not going to say everything right. I don't have the level of experience that you have. So like, please forgive me if I screw up. And that takes away the anxiety of like, you're walking on eggshells while you're trying to help this person. And I've also heard a lot of Black people say that, racism is not our problem. It's not something that we started, so it's not our responsibility to fix. 100% true. However, in a moment where white people are listening and we have the opportunity to frame the narrative, it is so much more advantageous to us to give them the guidance that they're asking for, rather than them get that guidance from other well-meaning white people who may not have the most accurate message. Like, we can just give them the straight dope in a way that will help us all in the long run. So that's sort of my last thing, did anybody else have a?
I got one last thought in response to something that Con said. Con said that this is not, it took hundreds of years to get here. It's not going to be repaired overnight. And that just made, I mean, it's such a huge point that we're going to need some long suffering in this from white folks. The building next to where I live was torn down. Someone bought it. They wanted to build something new. They tore the building down in a day. But it's taken them 2 years to build a new building in its place. Destruction can be fast, but repair takes a long time. And I think if we can ask our white allies to stay in it, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time. Please stick with this. Please carry this love. Please stay with us and let's repair this thing.
Right. And I think that it does benefit everybody. I try to impress on white people all the time that like ending racism helps you too, because it allows you to not get lumped in with, people who are actual racists. It allows you to, to be on the right side of history. It allows you to understand the struggle a little bit better. Like all that rising tide lifts all boats, black, white, and everything in between. And I guess we should oh, go ahead. Sorry.
And I'll just say just real quickly on that point, a system that does not allow all of its members to rise to the best of their potential. Look how much we're losing, how much resources, how much talent we are losing as a nation because we're not allowing our people to achieve their highest possible achievements. How many we might have had a cure to the fucking coronavirus right now if we were letting people reach their maximum potential. Who knows what, we might have a cure for cancer, but we're not letting people reach that hurts all of us. It doesn't just hurt black folk, it hurts all of us because we're not allowing the best and brightest to fully achieve and contribute to society everything that they possibly could. So until we solve this, we're never gonna be the great country that we could be or live up to the promise of what America's supposed to be because we are not letting our people contribute to the fullest of their capacity. And the last thing I'll say also just on the white ally thing is please don't make the mistake of trying to demonize folks that are looting or rioting or because it sets up this false equivalency, right? Of oh, well, it's the same thing as the brother that got shot in the back in Atlanta, right? Oh, well, he was wrestling with the police. He shouldn't have been doing that. Okay, but he didn't deserve to get shot in the back. He got murdered. That doesn't, we get into this place of false equivalency and we try to, and the media helps for, what they show. They don't show as much of the peaceful approach as they show people wilding out, right? But we can't get into that false equivalency. And I just speak from this from a personal, because I've had that conversation of someone saying, well, gosh, this looting is going to mess up the message. Like, no, what? How property versus terrorist murder, right? Systemic murder of people. It's not the same thing. And so get off that, like, stop trying to make that comparison. And then there was a video out. Last thing is just, when you're talking about 400 years of slavery, 50 years of you can't own any land. And if you try to, when you do it and you build up and you hook yourself up by the bootstraps, we're going to tear it down. Tulsa, Rosewood, Tulsa in 1920 on Black Wall Street, the first time that they threw bombs on a city's been bombed on American soil was whites dropping dynamite, burning the Tulsa down to the ground. So, and then you're not letting people advance. You have no opportunity. Look at it, put that on its head and look at what are we doing as a society where people are so desperate, so despondent, lack such resources that any opportunity that they have to go out and get something that we as a society, it was a woman that she said it so much better than I'm saying it, but it was so passionate. There's a video out there, she's talking about it. As a society, we market, you need the flashy car, you need the new kicks, you need the new clothes, you need the big house. but as a community, you will never, ever, ever get that because you don't have any resources, you have no job, you have no, so they have an opportunity to go out and get the things that they've been talking about, that have been promoted to them their whole lives. And we're gonna be surprised that they're out there. Come on, that's not even, that doesn't even make any kind of realistic sense. So we got to look at this very real. And to Wayne's point, stay out there. Don't give up on after the protest stop, after the news cycle ends. We can't let this movement in. We can't let this progress in. We have to continue to push because that's the only way we're going to see change in the long term.
I agree. Well, I want to thank everybody for taking the time out to be a part of the panel tonight. We got some incredible insights, and I think everybody who's watching online learned probably quite a ton. Thank you, Wayne. Thank you, Toni. Thank you, Konstantin. Thank you, Aaron. And thank you, Dan Meyer, for putting this together. And again, continue the work, man. Let's get that building built next door to Wayne's place, because otherwise it's just a giant hole in the earth. Metaphorically speaking. Absolutely.
Hey, thank you all.
Thank you.
All right.
Having me involved in this great discussion with this great panel of folks, and thank you guys out there watching. We appreciate you. Keep up the great work. Keep fighting.
Right on. You're muted. Yo, are we off?
Are we? Yeah, Dan, are we off?
Cool. Aaron, thanks for connecting me. This is cool. I'm glad we did this.
Wait, did we're off, right?
It's unclear. Maybe we should.
Chris, what's your, how can I follow you? What you're doing, Chris? I want to keep up.